The other thing that we should know about Honduras is that it was the jumping off point throughout the 80s, I would say, and
Correct.
90s of the illegal war that Oliver North was so fond of, the Contra War against the duly elected government of Nicaragua post the revolution in '79.
Right.
And so Honduras really became, the landing strips, the supply depot, and possibly even, where troops hung out while they waited to cross into
It was
Nicaragua.
a launching pad, essentially.
Huge impact.
Yeah.
And what, from your experience of being there, when you first did your work with this orphanage, what did you see of that? How did you feel that impact?
Well, I was in a sort of a rural area, so I really didn't have a whole lot of knowledge around the political structure of Honduras or even awareness. I mean, we were located really in
The hinterlands.
Exactly. So it wasn't really ironically enough, until I left Honduras that I began to learn more about the social construct of and the political climate, and sort of kind of evaluating the different kinds of things that I saw, which was extreme amount of poverty. 35% of the population live in extreme poverty, meaning that they can't afford even their basic needs. So I mean, it was definitely a climate that I learned more about as I left, and then sort of started to draw the connections together.
Okay, and then you went to work for Eighth Day Center, and somehow in the 3 years that happened between you starting there and now, the events conspired to get you back to Honduras. And for our listeners, we'll just do briefly what those events were. This summer, there was out of nowhere, according to, for most North Americans, out of nowhere, we get news of a coup.
Right.
So
On November 11th, 2008, the president of Honduras, President Zelaya, announced he wanted to conduct an opinion poll, which would basically ask the population if they wanted to have a fourth ballot box set in place for the upcoming elections. And this opinion poll would ask if there was, just to see if there was if people would want to have a change or a constitutional assembly with the Constitution. And as a result, he was forcibly, a few months later, forcibly removed from office. A lot of that having to do with General Velasquez, who was associated with the School of the Americas, who they stormed into his house.
What month was that?
That was in June.
I thought it was in the summer. Yeah.
He was taken to Costa Rica and forcibly removed from the country. So that being said, then then there was sort of a Congress set in place, and they had a quorum, and then they installed Roberto Michellette, who became sort of the interim president during this time. The reality was that not all of the Congress people were present at the time that he was installed, and so that was, in a sense, there was a very lack of democratic process in this installation of
well, yeah,
Michellette.
I mean, they kidnapped him.
Exactly.
And was that the military? That
was the military in Honduras, and sort of the myths that have been going on about that basically that one of the myths of the mainstream media saying, Manuel Zelaya wanted to change the Honduran constitution to extend his term in office. It should be stated that prior to Zelaya was democratically elected in 2005, and had begun to sort of align with more of the leftist. He raised the minimum wage in Honduras. He signed the ALBA Pact, the ALBA Pact being meaning dawn, and the ALBA Pact stating that it was sponsored by Hugo Chavez, stating that there was sort of an alternative to free trade with with the United States. And so these sort of actions sort of preempted the coup in a sense. And so so the reality is that he denied the fact that he wanted to change the Constitution many times. He basically wanted to hold an opinion poll on whether or not to hold a non-binding referendum to see if the people thought that a constitutional assembly should be held to consider changing the Constitution. And that, in essence, is not illegal. The reality is that all the charges that have been put against him, he's not been formally charged with anything. So
yeah, so when you say all the charges, you're just talking about things that, rumors, just things floating in the press, floated in the press, but nothing official.
Nothing official.
So basically, they had to snatch him because they couldn't get him really for anything,
right?
Except being scarily similar to Hugo Chavez.
Well, and that was sort of the line that kept repeating in the mainstream media.
We've heard this before.
Exactly.
I know you're young, but when I was your age, there was something about the domino theory, and it was the excuse for us going into a lot of Central American countries beforehand, and Nicaragua represented the one that hung out the longest and actually had a successful democratically run election that threw off the perpetrators, but everywhere else it was bloodshed. Mm-hmm. So now Honduras, it was bad news to hear that yet another Central American nation had been at the effect of an army coup,
right.
Basically.
And essentially the United States had their first initial position was to condemn the coup. However, later on, finally said that, yes, there are conditions for free and fair elections. So they were kind of waffling back and forth with their position against the coup.
And we did this through the mouthpiece of the Senate, the State Department?
The State Department, Hillary Clinton, and basically stating that ultimately that there were conditions in place that said that, that there are just conditions for free and fair elections. And so our purpose for going to Honduras was to sort of observe this electoral climate prior and during the elections, to kind of take note and witness the different things that we heard from human rights organizations, different people living in communities throughout the country, and sort of their perspective on what kind of climate they were dealing with. And the most repeated statement from people was, "This is democracy at the barrel of a gun." We traveled with. I should back up and say that we traveled with a group called the Quixote Center, which is a multi-issue grassroots social justice center.
Out of where?
Out of Washington, D.C. And there were 20 of us, five from Canada, five school teachers from Canada, and then 15 different representatives from peace and justice organizations, like myself. And just basically our premise was to observe the electoral climate in which this process was taking place.
Did your delegation include trained election observers?
That's a good distinction. We were not there to officially observe the electoral process. We were there primarily to witness and document human rights violations within the country prior to and during the election. So and it's important to note too that the Organization of American States and the Carter Center all boycotted the electoral observations of this country, or because of the fact that they found this to be that this was unfair and unfair conditions.
Well, that is very significant, yes, because those are the officially recognized bodies who are trained and experienced in making an assessment of whether or not the climate is right for a fair election or exists for a fair election.